Imagine a world map from 1938. Now look at one from 1948. It's not the same planet. The colors are different. The lines are in new places. Entire countries have vanished, while others have appeared as if from nowhere. The end of the Second World War was not just an armistice, it was a global demolition and reconstruction project. It was the single greatest redrawing of the world map in modern history. How did entire countries physically move hundreds of kilometers to the west? Why did an ancient nation suddenly reappear in the Middle East after 2,000 years? What invisible lines, like the Iron Curtain, became more real and imposing than any river or mountain range? The decisions made in a few short conferences by a handful of men in rooms thick with cigar smoke echoed for generations, creating the world we inhabit today. The borders they drew both on paper and in ideology set the stage for the next 50 years of conflict, alliance, and human movement. The world we know was born in the rubble of the old. Number 20. How could a single country be split in two for half a century? After the conflict ended in 1945, Germany was a wreck. The victorious Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France, had to figure out what to do with it. Their solution, agreed upon at conferences like Yalta in February 1945 and Potsdam in July-August 1945, was to divide the country into 4 occupation zones. Each power would manage one zone. The capital, Berlin, though deep inside the Soviet zone, was also split into 4 sectors. This was meant to be a temporary arrangement, but it didn't stay temporary. The wartime alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union quickly fell apart. They had fundamentally different ideas about how Germany and Europe should be run. The West, led by the US, wanted to rebuild Germany as a democratic capitalist nation. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, wanted a weak, compliant Germany that would serve as a buffer state and pay heavy reparations. These competing visions made cooperation impossible. The first major crisis was the Berlin blockade. In 1948, the Western powers introduced a new currency in their zones to stabilize the economy. The Soviets saw this as a threat and cut off all land and water access to West Berlin. They hoped to starve the Western sectors into submission. The US and its allies responded with the Berlin Airlift, a monumental effort that flew in food, fuel, and supplies for nearly a year. The historian Daniel F. Harrington detailed this logistical miracle in his book, Berlin on the Brink. The airlift kept West Berlin alive and demonstrated the West's resolve. The blockade failed, but it solidified the division. By 1949, 2 separate German states existed. In May, the 3 Western zones were merged to form the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany. Its capital was Bonn. Konrad Adenauer became its first chancellor. A few months later, in October, the Soviet Union established the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, in its zone. Its capital was East Berlin. The map now showed 2 Germanys. This division wasn't just a line on a map, it was a tier through families, communities, and a shared culture. For the next 40 years, these 2 states would represent the front line of the Cold War, 2 opposing worlds living side by side. The Berlin Wall, built later in 1961, was the physical manifestation of this deep ideological chasm. The temporary solution had become a permanent fixture of the global map. What if the Berlin airlift had failed? Would all of Berlin have fallen under Soviet control, changing the entire dynamic of the Cold War in Europe? Were there secret back-channel negotiations during the blockade that offered a unified, neutral Germany? And if so, who rejected them? How much did the personalities of leaders like Truman and Stalin, rather than pure geopolitics, contribute to the permanent division? Number 19, can an entire country be picked up and moved? The story of Poland after the war is one of the most dramatic geographic shifts in history. The country didn't just have its borders redrawn, it was physically moved westward on the map. This was not a natural migration, it was a calculated geopolitical decision made by the Big Three: Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin at the conferences in Tehran and Yalta. The reason was complex. The Soviet Union had occupied eastern Poland in 1939 as part of a pact with the German government of the time. Stalin was determined to keep this territory after the war. The land included major cities like Lwów, now Lviv, and Wilno, now Vilnius, to compensate Poland for this massive loss in the east. the Allies agreed to give it a huge chunk of German territory in the west. This territory included the rich industrial region of Silesia and lands in Pomerania and East Prussia. The new borders were stark. In the east, the border was roughly set along the Curzon Line, a boundary proposed after World War I. In the west, the new border was the Oder-Neisse Line, following two rivers. The result was that Poland lost about 70,000 square miles in the east and gained about 40,000 square miles in the west. Cities that had been German for centuries, like Breslau, Danzig, and Stettin, became Polish cities named Wrocław, Gdansk, and Szczecin. This wasn't just about drawing lines, it was about moving people on a almost unimaginable scale. The Potsdam Agreement of 1945 sanctioned the orderly and humane transfer of the German populations from the new Polish territories. In reality, it was a chaotic and often brutal exodus. Millions of Germans fled or were expelled westward. At the same time, millions of Poles were uprooted from the eastern territories, now absorbed by the Soviet Union, and were resettled in the newly acquired western lands. As historian R.M. Douglas documents in his book, Orderly and Humane, the Expulsion of the Germans After the Second World War, this was one of the largest forced migrations in human history. The demographic map of Central Europe was completely remade. A new, more ethnically homogeneous Poland was created, but at a tremendous human cost. The country's center of gravity, politically, culturally, and geographically, had shifted west. How different would Europe be today if Poland's pre-war borders had been restored? Were there any serious Allied considerations for opposing the westward shift, or was it accepted as a foregone conclusion to appease the Soviets? What are the true uncounted human and cultural losses from these massive state-sanctioned population transfers? So number 18, did new global institutions actually change the map? Before the Second World War, international relations were a free-for-all. The League of Nations, created after the First War, had proved powerless. After 1945, the victorious nations were determined not to make the same mistake. They believed a new world order required new institutions to manage it. This led to a redrawing of the map of global governance. The most important new institution was the United Nations, officially founded in San Francisco on October 24th, 1945. Its charter was signed by 51 original member states. Unlike the League of Nations, the UN was given more authority. Its central body, the Security Council, included the 5 major allied powers.org, the US, the USSR, the UK, France, and China as permanent veto-wielding members. This structure acknowledged the new reality of world power. The UN wasn't just a debating club. It had peacekeeping missions, humanitarian agencies, and a mandate to uphold international law. Its headquarters in New York became a new kind of global capital. At the same time, a new economic map was being drawn. In July 1944, delegates from 44 nations met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They designed a system to govern the post-war global economy and prevent the kind of financial chaos that had plagued the 1930s. This meeting, documented in Ben Stiles' book, The Battle of Bretton Woods, created 2 powerful institutions. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, was established to ensure currency stability. The World Bank was created to provide loans for reconstruction and development. The US dollar, pegged to gold, became the world's reserve currency. This system placed the United States at the center of the new global economic map. These new institutions fundamentally changed how countries interacted. They created a framework for international cooperation, conflict resolution, and economic activity. Of course, they were not perfect. The UN Security Council was often paralyzed by the Cold War veto. The IMF and World Bank were criticized for being dominated by Western interests. But their existence meant that for the first time, there was a permanent global architecture designed to manage world affairs. The map was no longer just about nations. It was now overlaid with a new grid of international organizations that held real power. Could the United Nations have been designed without the veto power? And would it have been more or less effective? What alternative economic systems were proposed at Bretton Woods, and why were they rejected? To what extent did these new institutions simply formalize the power of the victors rather than create a truly new and equitable world order? Number 17. How did the end of empires in Asia begin? The Second World War shattered the myth of European colonial invincibility. Powers like Britain, France, and the Netherlands were overwhelmed in Asia. After the war, they tried to reclaim their colonies, but the world had changed. The desire for independence, which had been growing for decades, exploded. The map of Asia was about to be completely redrawn by the people who lived there. India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, and its journey to independence was a sign of things to come. The war had exhausted Britain financially and morally. The new Labour government, led by Clement Attlee, recognized that holding on to India was no longer possible. But independence was complicated by deep religious divisions between Hindus and Muslims. The decision was made to partition the subcontinent. In August 1947, two new nations were born, a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan. Pakistan itself was a geographical oddity, split into two parts, West and East Pakistan, separated by 1,000 miles of Indian territory. The partition, overseen by the last viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, led to one of the largest and most violent migrations in history. The new borders drawn by British lawyer Cyril Radcliffe created instant chaos. The creation of India and Pakistan was a monumental change to the world map, signaling the beginning of the end for the British Empire. The Dutch faced a similar struggle in their colony, the Dutch East Indies. Indonesian nationalists, led by Sukarno, had declared independence in 1945, right after the end of the war. The Dutch refused to recognize it and tried to reestablish control through military force. What followed was a bitter 4-year war of independence. The United States, initially neutral, eventually pressured the Netherlands to negotiate, fearing the conflict would push Indonesia toward communism. In 1949, the Netherlands formally recognized the independence of Indonesia. A vast archipelago of thousands of islands became a single, independent nation. In French Indochina, the story was even more fraught. The nationalist leader Ho Chi Minh also declared Vietnam's independence in 1945. But France, determined to hold on to its empire, fought back. This led to the First Indochina War, which would last for years and eventually draw in the superpowers, leading to further conflict and a divided Vietnam. The post-war period didn't bring peace to Asia. It brought a wave of decolonization that permanently erased old colonial boundaries and created the new independent nations we see on the map today. If Britain had refused to grant independence in 1947, could it have held on to India? And for how long? Were there viable alternatives to the partition of India that were ignored by the British administration? How did the early success of Indonesian independence influence other anti-colonial movements across the globe? Number 16. What happens when two superpowers claim the same prize? Korea, a peninsula that had been under Japanese rule since 1910, was a footnote in the grand strategy of World War II. But in the final days of the conflict, its fate became a flashpoint for a new kind of global rivalry. The map of Korea was about to be sliced in half by an arbitrary line drawn by distant officials. As the war in the Pacific wound down in August 1945, Soviet forces entered the northern part of Korea to engage Japanese troops. The United States, concerned that the entire peninsula would fall under Soviet control, needed to act fast. According to the memoirs of American officials like Dean Rusk, two young U.S. Army officers working late at night in Washington, D.C., were given the task of finding a dividing line for a temporary joint occupation. They looked at a map and chose the 38th parallel, a line of latitude that split the country roughly in half and, crucially, left the capital city of Seoul in the American zone. The Soviets, surprisingly, agreed to this proposal. This was supposed to be a temporary measure, a practical way to manage the surrender of Japanese forces. The plan was for the U.S. and the Soviet Union to oversee the creation of a single, independent Korean government. But as in Germany, the Cold War intervened. The two superpowers backed different Korean leaders and different political systems. In the north, the Soviets supported Kim Il-sung, a communist guerrilla leader. In the south, the U.S. backed Syngman Rhee, a staunch anti-communist. All attempts to hold nationwide elections failed. By 1948, two separate states had been formally established. In the south, the Republic of Korea, South Korea was declared. In the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea was created. The 38th parallel, a temporary administrative line, had hardened into a fortified international border, an iron curtain in Asia. This division was not chosen by Koreans, it was imposed upon them. The new map showed two Koreas where one had existed for centuries. This division would lead directly to the Korean War in 1950, a brutal conflict that cemented the division and ensured that the line on the map would remain one of the most heavily militarized and tense borders in the world. What if the US had not proposed a dividing line? Would the entire Korean peninsula have become a Soviet-aligned state? Were there Korean political groups that could have successfully unified the country without foreign interference? How much did the US and Soviet Union know about the local political dynamics when they made their fateful decision? Number 15. How can a new country appear in a place of ancient conflict? The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 was one of the most consequential and controversial map changes of the post-war era. It redrew the map of the Middle East and created a new focal point for global politics. The roots of this event were deep, but the end of World War II created the conditions that made it possible. The territory then known as Palestine was administered by Great Britain under a mandate from the League of Nations. For decades, the Zionist movement had advocated for the establishment of a Jewish national home there. Jewish immigration to the region had increased, leading to rising tensions and conflict with the local Arab population. After the war, the situation became untenable for Britain. The country was financially drained and facing pressure from all sides. The Jewish groups, many of whom were survivors of the devastation in Europe, were determined to create a state. The Arab leaders were equally determined to prevent it. Unable to find a solution, Britain handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations in 1947. A special committee, UNSCOP, was formed to investigate. They recommended partitioning Palestine into two independent states, one Arab and one Jewish, with the city of Jerusalem to be under international administration. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted to adopt this partition plan under Resolution 181. The United States and the Soviet Union, in a rare moment of agreement, both voted in favor. The Jewish leadership in Palestine accepted the plan, but Arab leaders and neighboring Arab states rejected it outright. As Britain prepared to withdraw, violence escalated. On May 14, 1948, the day the British mandate expired, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The United States, under President Harry Truman, recognized the new state within minutes. The Soviet Union soon followed. The next day, armies from neighboring Arab states invaded, sparking the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. By the time an armistice was signed in 1949, Israel had not only secured its existence, but had also expanded its territory beyond the borders proposed by the UN partition plan. The map of the Middle East was permanently altered. A new nation existed, but the proposed Arab state was never formed, and the conflict over land and sovereignty had just begun. What if the UN had proposed a single binational state instead of partition? Could it have worked? Why did both the US and the USSR, fierce rivals, support the creation of Israel in 1947? What would the map of the Middle East look like today if the Arab states had accepted the UN partition plan? Number 14, how did a line drawn in Europe get a name? In the immediate aftermath of the war, the new dividing lines in Europe were not yet fully understood by the public. But on March 5, 1946, in a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave this new reality a powerful and enduring name. He declared, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." The Iron Curtain was not a physical wall. Not yet. It was a metaphor for the political, military, and ideological barrier erected by the Soviet Union to seal itself and its satellite states in Eastern Europe off from the West. This speech, often seen as one of the opening salvos of the Cold War, didn't create the division, but it defined it for the world. It drew a clear line on the mental map of everyone living at the time. On one side was the West, with its democracies and market economies. On the other was the East, the Soviet bloc, with its single-party states and command economies. The countries behind this curtain included Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. While technically independent, their governments were heavily influenced or directly controlled by Moscow. Yugoslavia under Josip Broz Tito was also communist but managed to maintain its independence from Soviet control, creating a unique gray area on the map. The division was solidified by two competing economic and military plans. In 1947, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, a massive aid program to help rebuild Western Europe and prevent the spread of communism. The Soviet Union forbade its satellite states from participating and created its own alternative, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance (COMCON) in 1949. This invisible line had very real consequences. Travel and communication between East and West became extremely difficult. Families were separated. Economic ties were severed. Two Europes developed in isolation from one another. The Iron Curtain was a stark representation of the new bipolar world, dominated by the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Churchill's phrase had turned a complex geopolitical situation into a simple, powerful image that everyone could understand. The map was no longer just about nations. It was about two opposing camps. Was Churchill's Iron Curtain speech a necessary warning to the West, or was it a provocative act that deepened the division? How did ordinary people living near this new invisible border experience its sudden creation? Were there any serious attempts by European leaders in the late 1940s to bridge the East-West divide before it became permanent? Number 13, how did Japan's empire vanish from the map? Before and during the war, Japan controlled a vast empire that stretched across the Pacific and East Asia. It included the Korean peninsula, the island of Taiwan, then called Formosa, Manchuria in China, and numerous islands across the Pacific. The end of the war in August 1945 meant the complete and total dismantling of this empire. The map of Asia was about to be redrawn as Japan was forced back to its home islands. The terms of surrender, laid out in the Potsdam Declaration of July 1945, were clear. Japan would be stripped of all its overseas territories. Under the subsequent Allied occupation led by U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, this was systematically carried out. Korea, as we've seen, was divided and set on a path to separate nationhood. Taiwan was handed back to the control of the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek. The islands that Japan had taken from Germany after World War I, such as the Marianas and the Marshall Islands, were placed under a U.S.-administered United Nations trusteeship. The southern half of Sakhalin Island and the Kuril Islands were occupied and later annexed by the Soviet Union, a point of contention that continues to this day. This territorial stripping was absolute. The San Francisco Peace Treaty signed in 1951 formalized these losses, and Japan was reduced to its 4 main islands and a few minor ones. This wasn't just a political change, it was a fundamental shift in Japan's identity. The country was demilitarized, and its new constitution, written under American supervision, famously renounced war. The economic and political focus of the nation turned inward. The collapse of the Japanese empire created power vacuums across Asia. In some places like Korea, it led to superpower conflict. In others, it fueled local nationalist movements that had been fighting for independence. The map didn't simply revert to its pre-1930s state. New forces and new nations rose to fill the space left by the vanished empire. The post-war settlement completely remade the political geography of East Asia, ending a half-century of Japanese expansion and setting the stage for the new conflicts and alliances that would define the region for the rest of the 20th century. What if Japan had, been allowed to keep some of its overseas territories, such as Taiwan or some Pacific islands? How would that have changed the Cold War in Asia? Did the complete dismantling of its empire contribute to Japan's post-war economic success by allowing it to focus solely on domestic recovery? How do the unresolved territorial disputes, like the Kuril Islands, continue to affect regional politics today? Number 12, why did an old empire lose its last pieces? And Italy, like Germany and Japan, was on the losing side of the war. As a result, its map was also redrawn, though perhaps less dramatically than the others. The changes involved losses of European territory and the final end of its short-lived colonial empire in Africa. The 1947 Treaty of Peace with Italy, signed in Paris, laid out the new borders. In the west, minor adjustments were made to the border with France. More significantly, in the east, Italy lost the Istrian Peninsula, a number of Adriatic islands, and the port city of Fiume, now Rijeka, to Yugoslavia. This transfer of territory was accompanied by an exodus of ethnic Italians from the region, known as the Istrian-Dalmatian Exodus. The most contentious issue was the city of Trieste. It had a mixed Italian and Slovene population and was claimed by both Italy and Yugoslavia. The peace treaty couldn't solve the dispute, so it created a temporary and ultimately unworkable solution: the Free Territory of Trieste. This small territory was split into two zones, one administered by the Allies Zone A, including the city itself, and one by Yugoslavia Zone B. This awkward arrangement lasted until 1954, when a final agreement was reached. Zone A was given to Italy and Zone B to Yugoslavia. The line on the map in this corner of the Adriatic had finally been settled. Beyond Europe, Italy was forced to renounce all claims to its African colonies. This included Libya, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland. These territories had been a source of national pride for the pre-war government, but were now gone. Libya was set on a course for independence, which it achieved in 1951. Eritrea was federated with Ethiopia. And Italian Somaliland was placed under an Italian-administered UN trusteeship for 10 years before it gained independence in 1960 and merged with British Somaliland to form Somalia. The loss of its empire marked the end of Italy's ambitions as a major colonial power. The post-war settlement confined Italy to its European peninsula, redefining its place in the world. What if the Free Territory of Trieste had remained a permanent, independent city-state? Could it have become a Hong Kong of the Adriatic? How did the loss of its colonies impact Italy's national identity and its post-war economic recovery? Were the border changes with Yugoslavia the fairest possible solution, or did they create new, lasting grievances in the region? Number 11. Did military alliances create a new kind of map? After the war, the world was divided not just by ideology, but also by military alliances. These alliances drew new, powerful lines across the globe, creating a map of mutual defense pacts and military blocs. The two most important were NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was founded in 1949. Its original members included the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European countries, such as the United Kingdom, France, and Italy. The core of the treaty was Article 5, which stated that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. This was a direct response to fears of Soviet expansion. The U.S., which had a history of avoiding entangling alliances, was now formally committed to the defense of Western Europe. NATO created a unified military command structure and led to the stationing of large numbers of American troops and weapons in Europe. This military alliance drew a hard line down the center of the continent, a line that was backed by overwhelming military power. The Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies saw NATO as an aggressive threat. In 1955, after West Germany was admitted into NATO, they formed their own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. This pact included the Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. On paper, it was a mutual defense treaty just like NATO. In reality, it was an instrument for the Soviet Union to institutionalize its military control over its satellite states. The Warsaw Pact unified the military command of the Eastern Bloc under Moscow's direction. The creation of these two opposing alliances formalized the military division of Europe. The map was now a checkerboard of armed camps. Any conflict on the border between East and West Germany, for example, had the potential to trigger a war between the two most powerful military alliances in human history. This balance of terror, especially after both sides developed nuclear weapons, defined the geopolitical landscape for decades. The lines on this new military map were, for many, the most important and dangerous lines of all. Could the Cold War have been managed without the creation of formal military alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact? And did the existence of NATO make war less likely by providing a clear deterrent, or more likely by creating an atmosphere of confrontation? What would have happened if a major member state had tried to leave either alliance during the height of the Cold War? Number 10. How was the map of Eastern Europe simplified and Sovietized? The Soviet Union suffered immense devastation during the war, but it emerged as a military superpower with control over a vast swathe of Eastern Europe. In the years immediately following 1945, Stalin moved to consolidate this control, redrawing both the external borders and the internal political maps of the region. The most direct map change was the USSR's own expansion. It formally annexed the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which it had occupied in 1940. These countries vanished from the world map as independent states for the next 50 years. The Soviet Union also took significant territory from several other countries. As mentioned, it kept eastern Poland. It annexed the region of Bessarabia from Romania, creating the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic. It took a piece of Czechoslovakia, the region of Subcarpathian Ruthenia, and it took territory from Finland after the Winter War and the Continuation War. The western border of the Soviet Union had been pushed significantly westward. Within the remaining countries of Eastern Europe, a different kind of map was being drawn. While they remained nominally independent, their political systems were remade in the Soviet image. Between 1945 and 1948, communist parties, with direct support from Moscow, systematically eliminated or neutralized all political opposition. Through a process described by Hungarian communist leader Matyas Rákosi as salami tactics, slicing away opponents one by one, they took complete control of the governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. The 1948 coup in Czechoslovakia, a country that had been a democracy before the war, was a particularly clear signal to the West that the region was now firmly under Soviet domination. This political transformation created a monolithic bloc of Soviet-aligned states. Their economies were reoriented toward Moscow through the Comecon, and their militaries were integrated through the Warsaw Pact. The rich diversity of pre-war Eastern Europe was replaced by a politically uniform map of single-party states, all following the same ideological blueprint. This new political geography, the Soviet bloc, would remain a fixed feature of the world for more than 4 decades. Were there any Eastern European countries that had a realistic chance of resisting Soviet domination in the late 1940s? How much did the Western powers know about the process of Sovietization as it was happening, and could they have done anything to stop it? To what extent were local communist leaders acting on their own initiative versus following direct orders from Moscow? Number 9, what happened to the state that disappeared and then came back? Austria's story after the war is unique. The country had been annexed by its northern neighbor in the Anschluss of 1938, effectively disappearing from the map as an independent state. The Moscow Declaration of 1943, issued by the Allies, stated their intention to see a free and independent Austria re-established. However, after the war ended, Austria, like Germany, was divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. The capital, Vienna, was also divided. For 10 years, Austria existed in this state of limbo. It had a single democratically elected government, but the country was occupied by foreign troops, and its ultimate fate was uncertain. The situation was tense. Unlike Germany, however, Austria was not partitioned. The Austrian government, led by figures like Chancellor Julius Raab and Foreign Minister Leopold Figl, skillfully navigated the complex Cold War politics. They pursued a policy of neutrality, convincing both the West and the Soviets that an independent but neutral Austria posed no threat to either side. The breakthrough came in 1955. After years of negotiation, the 4 occupying powers agreed to sign the Austrian State Treaty. This treaty, signed at the Belvedere Palace in Vienna on May 15, 1955, formally re-established Austria as a sovereign, independent, and democratic state. A key condition of the treaty was that Austria declare its permanent neutrality. The last foreign soldier left Austrian soil in October 1955. Austria was back on the map. It was a remarkable achievement, a rare moment of consensus during the height of the Cold War. Austria became a neutral buffer zone between the NATO and Warsaw Pact blocs. Vienna soon became a major international center, hosting UN agencies and serving as a neutral meeting ground for East-West talks. The re-emergence of Austria showed that it was possible, under very specific circumstances, to escape the rigid division that had defined post-war Europe. The redrawing of the map in this case was an act of restoration. Why was Austria allowed to reunify and become neutral while Germany was not? Was there a secret deal made between the Soviets and the West regarding Austria's fate? How crucial was the role of Austrian politicians themselves in securing their country's independence, and could their strategy have worked elsewhere? Number 8, how did a civil war in Asia create a second China? While Europe was dealing with its divisions, a monumental power shift was taking place in Asia. China had been embroiled in a long and brutal conflict, which was caused by an uneasy alliance during the war against Japan. After 1945, the civil war between the nationalist government, the Kuomintang, or KMT, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communist forces, led by Mao Zedong, resumed with full intensity. The United States supported the nationalists, providing them with money and weapons. The Soviet Union provided some support to the communists. Despite their initial advantages, the nationalists were plagued by corruption and incompetence, and they lost popular support. Mao's forces, on the other hand, were highly disciplined and won over the peasantry with promises of land reform. By 1949, the communists had achieved a decisive victory on the mainland. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square in Beijing and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China, PRC. This was a seismic event that redrew the political map of Asia and the world. The world's most populous country was now a communist state allied with the Soviet Union. But the story didn't end there. Chiang Kai-shek and the remnants of his nationalist government, along with about 2 million soldiers and civilian followers, fled across the strait to the island of Taiwan. There, they established a government in exile, continuing to call themselves the Republic of China, ROC, and claiming to be the legitimate government of all of China. This created a strange and enduring ambiguity on the world map. For decades, there were two Chinas. Most Western nations, led by the US, recognized the ROC on Taiwan as the real China. The PRC on the mainland was isolated. The bamboo curtain had fallen. This two China's situation defined Asian politics for decades, leading to tensions and military standoffs in the Taiwan Strait. The question of Taiwan's status remains one of the most complex and sensitive geopolitical issues in the world today, a direct legacy of the map that was redrawn in 1949. What if the US had provided more direct military support to the nationalists? Could they have won the Civil War? Was there any chance for a coalition government between the nationalists and communists after the war? How did the flight to Taiwan and the creation of a separate state change the culture and identity of the island itself? Number 7, could a new kind of law redraw the map of human rights? The end of the war revealed a scale of institutional cruelty that shocked the world. In response, there was a powerful movement to create a new international framework to protect human rights. This didn't change physical borders, but it redrew the conceptual map of sovereignty and the relationship between states and their citizens. The first major step was the establishment of the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals to prosecute leaders from the defeated powers for war crimes. These trials established the principle that individuals could be held accountable for their actions, even if they were following orders from a government. This was a radical idea that challenged the traditional notion of state sovereignty. Building on this, the new United Nations made human rights a central part of its mission. The UN Commission on Human Rights, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, was tasked with drafting a global statement of rights. The result was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights (UDR), adopted by the UN General Assembly on December 10, 1948. The declaration was not a legally binding treaty, but it was a powerful moral statement. For the first time, the international community had agreed on a common standard for how all human beings should be treated. It asserted that rights like life, liberty, and security of person were universal, not privileges granted by a state. At the same time, work began on updating the laws of war. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 were a set of 4 treaties that established new, detailed rules for the treatment of civilians, prisoners of war, and sick and wounded soldiers during wartime. These conventions made it clear that there were limits to what a military could do even in the heat of conflict. They created a new legal map that, in theory, protected individuals even when their governments were at war. These new legal frameworks were a profound attempt to change the rules of the international system, drawing new lines of responsibility and accountability on the global map. Did the Universal Declaration of Human Rights have any real impact in its early years, or was it just a symbolic document? How did the principle of individual accountability established at Nuremberg change international law forever? Were there any rights that were debated, but ultimately excluded from the UDR, and why? Number 6, how did a continent begin to awaken? While the major decolonization movements after the war were in Asia, the seeds of change were also being sown in Africa. The war had a profound impact on the continent. Hundreds of thousands of African soldiers had fought for the colonial powers. They had seen the world, been exposed to new ideas about freedom and self-determination, and had seen their colonial masters defeated. They returned home with new expectations. The post-war world was also ideologically hostile to colonialism. The new superpowers, the US and the USSR, were both, for different reasons, opposed to the old European empires. The United Nations Charter included the principle of self-determination. The independence of India in 1947 sent a powerful message to nationalist leaders across Africa. The empires were not invincible. The process was slow at first. The colonial powers, particularly Britain and France, tried to reform their empires rather than dismantle them. They invested more in development and allowed for greater local political participation, but these reforms only fueled the demand for full independence. The leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in the Gold Coast, now Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and Leopold Sedar Senghor in Senegal began to build mass political movements. The Fifth Pan-African Congress, held in Manchester, England in 1945, was a key event. It brought together many future leaders of independent Africa and called for an end to colonial rule. The first major breakthrough in sub-Saharan Africa came in 1957 when Ghana gained its independence from Britain. This event, as documented in Martin Meredith's book, The Fate of Africa, triggered a chain reaction. Within a few years, a wave of independence swept across the continent. The wind of change, as British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan called it, was blowing. The map of Africa, which in 1945 was a patchwork of European colonies, was on the verge of being completely redrawn into a continent of independent nations. The post-war settlement had created the conditions for the end of empire in Africa. How did the experiences of African soldiers in World War II directly contribute to the rise of independence movements back home? What if the colonial powers had offered a path to dominion status, like Canada or Australia, instead of resisting independence? How did the rivalry between the US and the USSR influence the process and outcome of decolonization in Africa? Number 5, did a new world appear on the map? The post-war map was quickly defined by the two opposing blocks of the Cold War, the First World of the capitalist West, and the Second World of the communist East. But many of the newly independent nations in Asia and Africa did not want to be forced to choose a side. They sought a third path. This led to the emergence of a new conceptual block on the world map, the Third World and the Non-Aligned Movement. The term Third World was originally coined by the French demographer Alfred Sauvy in 1952. He compared these nations to the third estate of the French Revolution, the common people who were exploited by the clergy and nobility. These were the nations that were non-aligned with either superpower. They were often poor, developing countries that had recently emerged from colonial rule. The political expression of this idea was the non-aligned movement. Its origins can be traced to the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955. This conference brought together leaders from 29 Asian and African countries. It was a powerful statement of a new force in world politics. Key figures in the movement included India's Jawaharlal Nehru, Indonesia's Sukarno, Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, and Yugoslavia's Josip Broz Tito. The non-aligned movement was formally established at the Belgrade Conference in 1961. Its members refused to join either NATO or the Warsaw Pact. They advocated for peaceful coexistence, national independence, and an end to colonialism and racism. They acted as a significant voting bloc in the United Nations, often challenging the dominance of the superpowers. The emergence of this group redrew the political map. It was no longer a simple bipolar world. There was now a large and influential group of nations that refused to be pawns in the Cold War. They had drawn their own space on the map. Was the non-aligned movement truly non-aligned, or did many of its members secretly lean toward one superpower or the other? How effective was the movement in actually influencing global events and the policies of the superpowers? Could such a movement exist in today's more interconnected and multipolar world? Number 4, how was Yugoslavia's unique map created? Yugoslavia's post-war story is different from that of any other country in Eastern Europe. The country had been torn apart during the war, but it was largely liberated by its own partisan forces led by the communist leader Josip Broz Tito. This was a crucial difference. Unlike in Poland or Hungary, the Red Army did not put Tito in power. He had won it himself. This gave Tito a degree of independence that no other Eastern European leader had. After the war, he moved to create a new Yugoslav state. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia was abolished, and the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia was declared in 1945. It was a federation of 6 republics: Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Macedonia. This internal map was designed to give representation to the major South Slavic ethnic groups, and in theory prevent the kind of interethnic conflict that had plagued the pre-war kingdom. Initially, Yugoslavia was a loyal member of the Soviet bloc, but Tito was not content to be a puppet of Moscow. He pursued his own foreign policy and his own, version of communism, which included more decentralized economic management. Stalin saw this as a direct challenge to his authority. In 1948, the conflict came to a head. The Cominform, an international organization of communist parties, expelled Yugoslavia. Stalin expected Tito's government to collapse. Instead, Tito rallied his people against Soviet pressure and survived. This Tito-Stalin split was a major event. It shattered the myth of a monolithic, unified communist world. Yugoslavia was now on its own, a communist state that was not aligned with Moscow. It began to receive aid from the West, which was happy to support a crack in the Iron Curtain. As we saw, Tito became one of the key founders of the non-aligned movement. The post-war map now had a unique anomaly, a communist country in Europe that was part of the Third World, charting its own course between the 2 major blocs. What if Tito had failed to resist Stalin's pressure in 1948? How would a Soviet-controlled Yugoslavia have changed the map of the Balkans and the Cold War? To what extent was the federal structure created by Tito successful in managing ethnic tensions during his lifetime? Was the eventual breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s inevitable, or was it a direct result of the end of the Cold War? Number 3. Why was Vietnam cut in half? The story of Vietnam's division is another tragic example of local aspirations for independence getting caught up in the global Cold War. As in Korea, a temporary dividing line drawn by foreign powers on a map became a hard and lasting border. After the defeat of Japan in 1945, the nationalist and communist leader Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But France, the former colonial power, was determined to reclaim its colony. This led to the First Indochina War, a brutal 9-year conflict between the French and Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh forces. The decisive battle came in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, where the Viet Minh won a stunning victory against a major French army. The defeat forced France to the negotiating table. The Geneva Conference of 1954 was convened to settle the conflict. The resulting agreement, the Geneva Accords, was a compromise. It temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The North would be controlled by Ho Chi Minh's government, while the South would be led by a non-communist government eventually headed by No Dinh Diem. The Accords explicitly stated that this was a temporary military demarcation line, not a political or territorial boundary. Nationwide elections were supposed to be held in 1956 to reunify the country. The elections never happened. The United States, which had not signed the Accords, feared that Ho Chi Minh would win a free election. It threw its support behind Diem's government in the South. The 17th parallel, like the 38th in Korea, hardened into a real border. The map now showed 2 Vietnams, a communist North and an anti-communist South. This division set the stage for the Second Indochina War, known in the West as the Vietnam War. The attempt to prevent a unified communist Vietnam by drawing a line on a map ultimately led to a much larger and more devastating conflict that would engulf the entire region for years. Were the 1956 reunification elections ever a realistic possibility, or were they doomed from the start by Cold War politics? What role did other powers like China and the Soviet Union play in the decision to partition Vietnam at the Geneva Conference? If Vietnam had been allowed to unify under Ho Chi Minh in 1956, how would the history of Southeast Asia have been different? Number 2, were the new borders drawn with people or with ink? One of the most profound ways the map was redrawn after the war was not through changing borders, but through moving the people within them. The post-war period saw the largest and most concentrated population transfers in European history. The goal of the Allied powers, stated in the Potsdam Agreement, was to create more ethnically homogeneous nation-states, in the belief that this would prevent future conflicts. The most significant movement was the expulsion of ethnic Germans from across Central and Eastern Europe. As Poland's borders shifted west, millions of Germans living in the territories newly annexed by Poland were forced to leave. Millions more were expelled from Czechoslovakia, particularly from the Sudetenland region. Germans were also forced out of Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, and the parts of East Prussia that had been annexed by the Soviet Union. In total, it is estimated that between 12 and 14 million German-speaking civilians were forced from their homes between 1944 and 1950. It was a demographic re-engineering of the continent on a massive scale. The ethnic map of Central Europe, a complex tapestry of intermingled communities for centuries, was wiped clean and redrawn along stark national lines. The historian Richard Overy details the immense scale and complexity of these movements in his book, The Dictators. But it wasn't just Germans who were moved. As the Soviet Union annexed eastern Poland, millions of Poles were repatriated from those lands to the new western territories of Poland. The Ukrainians in Poland were moved to the Soviet Union, Hungarians were moved out of Czechoslovakia, Italians were moved out of Yugoslavia. The partition of India in 1947, as previously discussed, created another massive and far more violent population exchange between India and Pakistan, involving an estimated 14 million people. These movements permanently changed the character of countless cities and regions. They created enormous refugee crises and left deep scars of loss and resentment. While the political map was being redrawn with new borders, a new demographic map was being created with uprooted human beings. Was the goal of creating ethnically homogeneous states a genuine attempt at peace, or was it a convenient justification for forced migration and collective punishment? What are the long-term psychological and cultural impacts on a nation that has been subject to such a massive population transfer? How many of the missing people from these transfers are still unaccounted for in official records? Number one, what did the world's new power map look like? The single most important way the global map was redrawn after World War II was the shift in the global balance of power. The old map, dominated by the European colonial empires of Britain and France, was gone forever. In its place was a new bipolar world dominated by two superpowers, with global reach and conflicting ideologies, the United States and the Soviet Union. Before the war, the United States had been a major economic power, but was often politically isolationist. The war changed that completely. It emerged from the conflict with its mainland untouched, its economy booming, and as the sole possessor of the atomic bomb. It was, without question, the most powerful nation on Earth. As the historian John Lewis Gaddis argues in The Cold War, A New History, the U.S. took on a new role as the leader and guarantor of the free world, using its economic power through the Marshall Plan and its military power through NATO to contain the spread of communism. The Soviet Union, despite its catastrophic human and material losses, emerged as the other superpower. The Red Army occupied half of Europe. It had the largest land army in the world and was rapidly developing its own atomic bomb, which it successfully tested in 1949. It became the undisputed leader of a new bloc of communist nations stretching from East Germany to North Korea. Its ideology offered a powerful alternative to Western capitalism, attracting followers across the developing world. This new power structure defined the post-war map. Every country, every conflict, every political decision was now viewed through the lens of this global rivalry. The world was divided into spheres of influence. Lines were drawn not just on maps of Europe and Asia, but across the entire globe. This bipolar map, with its two superpowers locked in a struggle for dominance, was the fundamental reality of the post-war world. All the other map changes, the division of Germany, the rise of the non-aligned movement, the process of decolonization, were shaped by this new stark and dangerous distribution of global power. How inevitable was the confrontation between the US and the USSR after the war? Could different leaders have found a way to continue the wartime alliance? What was the third most powerful country in the world in 1946, and did it have any real ability to influence the two superpowers? If the atomic bomb had not been developed, would the post-war map have been drawn differently?